Record. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So, in this section, we are introducing an edited edition of the sections of the text that we have been working on. As we mentioned, we reworked the title to call it Ladder of Guidance Insight into the Cornerstones of Salah. السلم في معرفة الأركان this should be معرفة الأركان الصلاة, not معرفة but that has to be correct. In any event, we reorganized the way that the text is presented to facilitate uh, the understanding of the main point. So here, the idea, we worked on this a couple weeks, is to break down the salah into parts, words, actions, and that which is neither a word nor an action. And so the way that this is presented, it highlights that aspect a little more so that you can get an understanding of what the text is getting at or what the educational purpose or value is. Because you can read these things anywhere, right? Uh, you can read about the Salah anywhere, but each text has its own value. Always, that's always the case. Every text is going to have some value. And so when we have to choose between texts, at least in my educational philosophy, we should look at the value of it, not always even the popularity. Sometimes the popularity of a text is beneficial. Why would a popular text be beneficial? Anybody have any ideas on that?
Because it's well known and people can kind of like have that similar source to refer back to, like everybody's familiar with it, to have a dialogue or remind each other on.
Yeah, that's a very good start. Anything else more technical, more scholarly based, but that's a foundational start. So texts that are very popular, usually the scholars put a lot of work into them. Um, and so then that goes back to the idea of some common ground that people are referring to, right? And so sometimes that's why there's a dislike to go to books that are not that popular because the, the books that are popular usually, not always, but usually they've been corrected, they've been well researched on multiple angles or in multiple ways. The authenticity of the text, as far as his attribution to the author. Did the author actually write the text? That's one. Two, the contents, the wording, the evidences. There's no fiqh book that has been written without evidences. Even if it doesn't present the evidences, uh, it's not going to be possible for there to be no evidences in if it's organized on some sort of madhab system, even outside of a madhab system, but we're not talking about that type of fiqh. We're talking about madhab fiqh, madhab based fiqh. All madhab based fiqh is grounded in evidence, but not all madhab books will present you the evidence, right? And there's reasons for that, the educational reasons. At times when you find these books, uh, هي مجردة عن الأدلة. هي مجردة عن الأدلة. Uh, that means that it's stripped of the evidences or is presented without the evidences or is taught in a way that evidences are not invoked or called upon. Uh, One of these, one of the reasons here is to facilitate for the student what we call tasawwur, the understanding of tasawwur al-mas'ala or al-masail, so that the student has the ability to conceptualize the issue, right? Or the student may be young in age, and so the teachers or the writer or the may think that it's not appropriate at that age to complicate the issue too much and introduce evidences, even if it's one or two. That has his own reasons why these books are written like that. Sometimes it's just a matter of uh, facility, or the sheikh is just writing from memory. Remember that there's a lot of repetition, a lot of imitation, a lot of taqlid uh, in in the presentation of madhabi fiqh. So that doesn't mean madhabi fiqh doesn't have its evidences. That's a misunderstanding among weak students of knowledge. Misunderstanding among weak students of knowledge who don't really understand how knowledge works. Right? That's something to be highlighted and noted. So usually in the lower tiers in madhabi based fiqh, you're not going to encounter too many evidences. The other thing is that sometimes, like in the case in Maliki fiqh of uh, Risali Abi Zayd al-Qarawani, uh, in the Risali or in the Risala to Abi Zayd al-Qarawani, he which is the correct pronunciation of the title, uh, Risala to uh, in that book, he summarizes the evidences, but you won't know it unless you have some. He summarizes the evidences and he reformulates their presentation. Put it in a simple way. He relates evidences in his own words. Uh, so he'll relate a hadith, but he'll simplify the meaning for the hadith and the wording. But it's a hadith. If you go and you investigate, realize that what he's saying is a hadith. And I've had that experience reading the Muwatta and seeing the Risali, reading the Risali to Abi Zayd together. And you'll see, you read the Muwatta of Imam Malik and you read the Risala of Abi Zayd, and you'll see, oh, this guy, he's just like transmitting whole hadith in his own words. Right. So that happens as well, sometimes for facility's sake and so on and so forth. Now, in the case of great scholars that were writing like that, they're very familiar with the evidences. So there's reasons why they write like that, and there's books that they have that clearly deal with the evidences. Now, when a student comes and a student only stays stuck in that type of fiqh that is being written without evidences, then the student lacks in understanding of the more intricate workings in the madhab, right? And mostly everybody's working at the lower level books. And I've mentioned this before, uh, and I'll mention it again. So the lower level books nowadays, there's really not too much discussion on the issue of evidences. That was a Salafi critique, and it had its place, but it also had its deficiencies, that critique. But what happened within the last 20 years or so, 25 years, uh, with some momentum, especially within the last 15 years, a lot of the smaller books in the madhab base fiqh that traditionally didn't mention evidences, at least in the detailed way, detailed evidences being ayat of the Quran and a hadith, and sometimes even in the general way or the dalil dalil al-ijmali, which is the evidences from usul al-fiqh. The and that basically means that this came from the Quran, this came from the Sunnah, this came from Qiyas, this came from Maslahat al-Mursila, or any other evidence that's there, right? Is speaking about evidences in terms of principles. When you start talking about detailed evidences, that just means um, a straight quote from the Quran and the Sunnah without understanding the principle. And that has a discussion in and of itself. Why that differentiation between the two? What's the benefit between the two? But the idea here is just to say that these smaller texts began uh, to see a printed version where these things were mentioned. And that's because, in part, there was some pushback. Uh, the Salafi critique created a revival in terms of how texts were presented. And that began because in the university setting, uh, that demand was felt in the university setting. So part of maybe taking a text and publishing it from written Arabic into printed digital Arabic, which is virtually almost like translating. Part of the project of if you did a master's thesis or if you did a PhD was that you had to research the hadith and you had to research the biographies and you had to research the ayat and you had to research the principles and evidences that were there. And so a lot of books began to be published at varying levels, especially the lower tier, with evidences. So now we push forward into our time period. All this movement has been made at the university level, at the print, just at the print level itself, publishing house level. So there's no such thing as books really existing without evidence in the way that it was presented in the past. That doesn't mean that those books didn't have evidence. They did have evidence. You can pull the evidences from uh the sources, the main sources that were being drawn from, or you can find them in the method. But what happened was that, there was a philosophy in fiqh which didn't pay a lot of attention to the evidences. And it was dominant for a while. And that philosophy in fiqh was not necessarily the mainstay, or it was not necessarily the way fiqh operates. It was just the way that some of the scholars were operating. And so with that said, we look at books for their educational value, not just their popularity. I mean, but the standard is that the book is popular, that we look at books with regard to their popularity because the scholars have done a lot of work on them. There's a lot of research and criticism. And so that means that that text is well served. Whereas, like a text like this, it has a lot of educational value, but it is not a text which is popular. It's not considered to be mu'tamid or relied upon in the method. That doesn't mean that it's not valuable. It doesn't mean that it's not reliable. It's just that it didn't go into that popularity circuit, to become a book. There's many books that are considered popular in the madhab and reliable, and the educational value is okay. You know what I'm saying? It's all right. It's known what the point is that is being pushed forward, but it doesn't necessarily uh, build a strong student of knowledge. It builds a student that knows content, that may know information, but a student that's thinking, uh, so that may be questionable. And so the thing that comes up is this: that when you have major scholars, like for instance, Qadi Iyad, and he writes his book, Al Qawaid, which is a basic book in Maliki fiqh. Now, Al-Qadi Iyad is a judge, is a muhaddith, is a faqih, is a scholar of hadith, is a scholar of fiqh, and he's a literal judge. So when he writes a book, a person of his caliber and standing, who at times is quoted in the madhab even, just because he writes a book and is not popular, do we put it to the side or do we look at the value of it? You know, the preferred text within the Shawkani study circle was that text uh, for teaching the arkan of Islam, for teaching the pillars of Islam, because of the structure of it, because of the way that it organizes knowledge, not because of other points, right? Not because of other points. So that's something that it has to be looked at. And the reality is that a lot of the books in the madhab are focusing on transmitting the concept of uh al-mu'tamad as far as the fatwa is concerned, or the mashhur concept. And the Malikis in the US are fanatical. Many of the Malikis in the US are fanatical. And sometimes when they speak, it is definitely not the way that I learned Maliki fiqh. When they speak, the mashhur in the madhab is it. You can't deviate from it. And then they're reading from lower level texts, and then they're reading these texts without understanding the fatawa of the ulama. When we say fatawa of the ulama, we're meaning the the ulama have been asked questions, the scholars have been asked questions, and then they respond to those questions. And usually those questions have something to do with the contemporary age. And so they respond back. Of those scholars who lost some popularity, and I mentioned this before, but I mention it again. Of those scholars who lost popularity because of political positions, is Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya. But Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya is a master in the madhab, is a master in the madhab. Um, he wrote the book Sanatul Fatwa, and that book was compiled from some of the best sources in Islamic tradition. And it was written for the mufti. It was written for the person of fatwa to understand how to give fatwa in the West, pretty much. Like, what are the guidelines for giving fatwa in the West? Not what are the things that we should tell the people, not the masail. He's not giving us the masail. He's teaching us what are the main principles that we need to be using that are operational in addition to the standard mufti practices uh, that are there to be put in place. It's an amazing text, amazing text. And so sometimes he says that he has a principle where he says sometimes a weak opinion in fiqh can be raised to an opinion of strength based on the idea that it achieves or realizes one of the objectives of the Sharia, one of the objectives of the Sharia. And so that contradicts the idea that the in this in the that contradicts the idea that we always have to follow the mashhur position. That we always have to follow the mashhur position. That goes against that concept. And when I studied with Sheikh Ahmed Taha, rahmatullahi alayhi, rahmatin wasi'ah, one time he gave the example that he would, because he used to teach in Mecca. He used to teach in Mecca and Medina uh, for some time. So he was talking about, and I think I mentioned this in this group some couple years back. He mentioned the reality of Hajj, and he said that in that madhab, he was stringent. He himself was stringent as a Maliki scholar, although he is not only rooted in Maliki fiqh, or he was not only rooted in Maliki fiqh, he was the head of the fiqh, a comparative fiqh department in the University of Sharia, or the school, or the College of Sharia. Actually, I should say the College of Sharia in Al Azhar, in the university side, because Al Azhar has a traditional side and then it has the university side, or has the university system, which goes from the lower level of education above, and then it has its traditional studies. But that aside, so he was a person that was, they were teaching comparative fiqh, but he had a madhab. He had the Maliki school. So he said he was stringent in the matter of tahara when it came to what purifies najasa, or what purifies filth. So he said, one of the things that is spoken about in the madhab, that if there's filth on the floor, on the ground actually, that it needs to be washed, or something needs to be put over it in order for a person to pray. In order for a person to pray. Now, in the Maliki school, the issue of the graveyard, the issue of where the animals settle, there's a lot of places in which other schools they say you can't pray, and in the Maliki school they say that you can pray as long as you protect yourself from filth, because they say that's the underlying cause, right? The whole issue of filth. And I don't want to go into the whole details of the graveyard and all of this, but the whole point of mentioning that is that there's areas where there's commonly known to be filth. And so in the Maliki school, the way of looking at it is, if you can protect yourself from the filth, you can pray there. Uh, and so one of the issues that comes up is that in Hajj, there was areas in Hajj at that time that there was a lot of filth, a lot of filth. And so it would be difficult to pray in, because you had all kind of filth. And so the Sheikh, he was stringent on the idea that in order to pray there, you had to purify the place with water. And so one of the students came back at him in a respectful way and said, Sheikh, if we go with the opinion of the Malikis in this sense, then you have thousands and thousands and thousands of people, their salah is invalid. The madhab of Abi Hanifa rahmatullahi alayh is that the sun purifies the ground. So the Sheikh said he was resistant towards that position because he was stringent on his uh Maliki stance. And he said after a while, he considered that reality and he accepted the position of Abu Hanifa, and he set aside the position of Malik in the interests of the people, in the interests of the people. And so sometimes when you hear me talk about, sometimes some people may think I have an anti-madhab stance, but I don't have an anti-madhab stance. The stance that I have is anti-understanding how to work with the madhabs, or forcing the madhabs on the people. Like for instance, in the US, we don't fight too much in the masjid, over in some masajid you have issues, but we usually have a general environment which is tolerant, is a generally tolerant environment. In some places in the US, you don't have that. You have a lot of back and forth and fighting and so on and so forth, whether it's the Hanafi madhab or following an Albani or the Hanbali madhab. You have some sectors or some communities that go back and forth with that, or even the Shafi school sometimes. But in the generally speaking, we don't have these problems, that there's a lack of tolerance in many of the masajid. Like I said, there's some masajid where that's clearly the case. There's some environments or communities where that's clearly the case that there is a back and forth. But when you begin to introduce one madhab, like was some brothers were trying to do in New Jersey, in a community, okay, for instance, you're Maliki, you're pushing the madhab. Your community is Hanafi, majority of it is Hanafi. You come in as the imam. So what are you gonna do? You're the imam. You don't know the Hanafi school. The community is Hanafi. Are you gonna enforce the the Maliki school against the Hanafi school? And we've seen that when and I gave that example before when I went to Chicago. They brought me to Chicago, and in part was when I was living there, they wanted me to teach. And part of it was maybe I may teach the Maliki Madhab, and I refused. And I said, here, majority of the people are Hanafi. If we bring in another Madhab, you're going to split the community up on fiqh, right? You're going to split the community up on fiqh. So it stays Hanafi, but we teach with evidences and we teach from a book that has more than one position as far as the schools are concerned, which was the book of the great scholar Mullah Ali Qari, scholar of Hadith, one of my favorite scholars. Scholar of fiqh, Hadith, recitation of Quran, tafsir. He's just like an amazing scholar, rahmatullahi alayhi. And so, that's the issue that comes up. And Sheikh Uthman then Fodi, rahmatullahi alayhi, he injected a similar approach, like when it comes to some flexibility in terms of dealing with the schools. And so he began to re-inject the whole issue of evidences as well, teaching evidences, because then you learn that fiqh as we know it is the understanding of the scholar. It can change on some things as long as there's no consensus. It's a matter of ijtihad. But to introduce a rigid, form of following a madhab can create a lot of problems, right? And the same thing when you abandon the madhab completely, it can create its own set of issues. And of the issues that it creates is that you're beginning the circle once again, a circle of investigation. You're beginning the circle of investigation. You're beginning the circle of research. So on particular issues, you're going to be stuck with a limited amount of opinions. Whereas in a madhab, you may have multiple, points of view on an issue, even though one may be chosen, but you still have multiple points of view. And then we go back to the position of Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya when it comes to fiqh. Sometimes the weak opinion can be the strong opinion, depending on if it realizes or if it clarifies or if it achieves establishing the objectives of the Sharia, right? That's something to really think about. Now, with all of that said, like, when I look at a person like Imam Shawkani, rahmatullahi alayhi, who this study circle was named after. Shawkani, one of the reasons why I named the study circle after Shawkani is because Imam Shawkani is has a certain amount of rigor, and he was Zaydi in his madhab, and he ended up trekking the path of which he had. Him and people like Amir Sana'ani, Imam Ibn Wazir, and a number of other ulama. The contemporary scholar, he passed away not too long ago, that was following in that pathway was uh Muhammad bin Ali al-Imrani, al-Qadi al-Imrani, from the scholars of Yemen. If you ask him about the Hanafi madhab, he knew about the Hanafi madhab. You ask him about the Shafi'i school, he knew about the Shafi'i school. If you asked him about the position of Sheikh al-Albani, he knew the position of Sheikh al-Albani. If you asked him about the Zaydi school, he knew about the Zaydi school. He knew about the Hanbali school, about the Maliki school. He was an ocean of knowledge. And because he had that sort of orientation, he united the people of Yemen. Because you know, Yemen civil war has been there for a while, and there's tribal warfare. And so Yemen was sectioned off into different groups. So you have different groups that are pretty advanced. Each of them was pretty advanced in terms of their knowledge base. And so they needed someone that was able to kind of mitigate between the tribes, so to speak, and even the tribes in knowledge. So Qadi al-Imrani was that type of person. So Shawkani was like that as well. Shawkani was the type of person that, even when it came to Aqidah, Shawkani was Athari in Aqidah, but was not opposed to ilm al-kalam and philosophy, like Ibn Taymiyyah to some extent. And he said that we shouldn't talk about these things in a negative unless we know what we're talking about, unless we have evidence. So he was not in favor of people talking against anything unless they had knowledge and experience of it. But when it came to a model of the contemporary Athari approach, Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i, Hafidhullah, he's still alive actually. May Allah prolong his life. He was one of my teachers. He was a Hanafi scholar and Maturidi Ashari. Primarily Maturidi, but he's Ashari, uh, of course, because he came out of the Azhari system.
What's his name?
Hassan al-Shafi'i.
Okay.
He's not a Shafi'i by madhab, but it's Shafi'i just his name. So he said that, that was one of the best models in the Athari school in the contemporary age was the way of the scholars of Yemen because of their balance, because of their balance. So they're not opposed to tasawwuf and all of that, but of course, some things where there's bid'ah, then the Sufis have bid'ah. There's no doubt about that. That's not to say that the Sufis are mubtadi'ah. That's a different statement. Sufis have bid'ah though, right? So the the you have to wade through, and that's not a Salafi critique. And I mentioned that many times over and over again. When you look at the book, Sharia and Tasawwuf. Sharia and Tasawwuf is a book that you can find in PDF. Okay.
فكذبوهم فأقروها فدمدم عليهم ربهم
Like Yusuf, I
Can you,
think you can mute people.
huh?
No, I don't know. Somebody was.
So the book Sharia and Tasawwuf is written by Maulana Muhammad Zakaria. Who Muhammad Maulana Zakaria is famous for being one of the scholars from Tablighi Jama'ah, but he's a scholar of Hadith, and he's a scholar of Hadith and has one of the best contemporary explanations of the Muwatta. One of the best contemporary explanations of the Muwatta, and he's a Hanafi. Uh, if you want a book that has the mostly on the four madhabs and a discussion on a hadith, if you want a book that gives the fatwa of the four madhabs and is considered to be reliable, that's your go-to book. That's one of the geniuses of that book, that it compiles all of the genius points, that it compiles the most uh, reliable or referred to positions of the four madhabs, and also he has intricate discussions on hadith. But especially on the hadith of the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Uh, so
What's the name
He
of that, Sheikh?
أوجز المسالك. أوجز المسالك. And the أوجز, um, it has it has a Hanafi flavor, of course, because he's Hanafi, but it doesn't limit itself to that. In any event, he wrote the book Sharia wa Tariqa, and I encourage everyone to read that book, Sharia wa Tariqa. You can find the PDF. If you can look for it, Ali, and put it in the chat box. Is is important. That book, he has a discussion on the way of tasawwuf and some of the prerequisites as far as knowledge is concerned. And then he goes into a discussion about following the sunnah versus following a tariqah. And so he goes into it and he talks about how uh, his sheikh was talking to him about this, so about these issues. And so you find a balance in what he's saying. So if you achieve what you achieve by way of following the sunnah, then that's the path. If you need some guidance from a teacher to put you on the path, so to speak, then there's no issue there as long as it's not the as long as you're not following into bid'ah, right? And so he puts a lot of burden on that in that regard on the student. But it's very balanced approach. Um, so in any event, part of what you go into when you go into something like that is you have to understand the knowledge base. And part of what happens in Sufism sometimes is this idea of separating between the knowledge of the Sheikh of Tariqah and the knowledge of the Faqih is really a detrimental but very popular um you know it's a detrimental but very popular uh position that people take, which they say the Sheikh of the Tariqah and the Sheikh of Fiqh, and they separate between the two. And sometimes the Sheikh of the Tariqah may not be a person of Fiqh, right? That's not a is not a good differentiation to make and to hold firm to that. So you have people like Sheikh Zarruq and Imam Sha'rani and people like that that they fought hard against that type of understanding, and so even though at the end Sheikh Zarruq was a master in fiqh, he declined to take that type of position. So though when you find deficiencies in knowledge, all kinds of problems emerge. That's one of the issues. To limit fiqh and say that fiqh is just looking at the actions of the body, but we look at the actions of the heart. That type of approach, it leads to a chasm, it leads to a gulf between Sharia and Tariqah. And that's kind of the argument that's made in the book Sharia wa Tariqah or Sharia and Tariqah. That's the argument that's made there. Um, in that book that there has to be a combination. And that's one of the things uh, in that regard, one of the things that you find that people like Deobandi scholars have really focused on that element. But again, some positions, some actions are always up for debate. As far as what should be practiced, what should not be practiced. So in any event, you see here, uh, these divisions are taking place between the words of the prayer, the acts of the prayer, and that which is neither word nor action of the prayer. Like, for instance, the issue of intention. So the issue of intention in that position, or rather under that topic, better said, under that topic, you're able to have a solid discussion about the heart in the salah. The heart in the salah. Right. From this section here, that which is neither word nor an action of the prayer. You can come back to the issue of intention, and there you can have a whole discussion about the inner dimensions of the salah. Now, one of the scholars that talks about the words, the acts, and the inner dimensions, like in the case of intention here, is Sheikh Abdul Salam. And Sheikh Abdul Salam, Sultan al-Ulama, he wrote a book called Maqasid al-Salah, or the objectives of the Salah, which is a small text, and he has a whole series in which he goes into the objectives of all of the arkan of Islam. Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi, he was one of the ones that created that division between fiqh and the life of the heart. But the difference is that in the Ghazalian system, the difference is that he had both realities together. Okay. So even though he talked about them as two separate things, he talked about fiqh as belonging to the dunya, and then he talked about the life of the heart, these things as knowledge of the akhirah. He had them together. So when he talked about these things as being separate, he had it within a framework. He didn't pluck it out of the framework and talk about it like one is higher or more exclusive than the other, and we don't have to give any importance to this side. You know what I'm saying? That's what happens sometimes uh, in some of the circles in Tasawwuf. There's the original pathway was that you had to be grounded in knowledge. And then when you're grounded in knowledge, then you deepen your knowledge with the understanding of life of the heart. Right. And when you're grounded in knowledge, then you're able to detect if something is a practice which is acceptable in the Sharia or not, or why it is that you're practicing what you're practicing. But in the Ghazalian system, it can be misunderstood. Yeah, I struggled with that issue for a lot of years because I like the system of Imam Ibn Khaldun a little better in that regard. Right. I like the system of Imam Ibn Khaldun a little better because he talks about what system are we talking about? Well, Imam Ibn Khaldun, when you start talking about knowledge, right? When you start talking about knowledge, uh,
Is Imam Ibn Khaldun mostly like his books written on like based on historical knowledge?
no, Imam Ibn Khaldun, uh, so this is what you call the divisions of knowledge. system of the divisions of knowledge or the categories and types of knowledge. Okay, so you have the Ghazalian type system and the Khaldunian type system. So here, knowledge is divided into knowledge of the deen and knowledge of the dunya. That's one way to look at it. Here, knowledge is divided into knowledge that belongs to al-aql and knowledge which belongs to al-naql or intellect is the source of that knowledge, and transmission is the source of this knowledge. Okay? So these divisions of knowledge or this way of looking at knowledge, how you classify knowledge, how you classify it. They have their own strengths. We don't throw it out because this is like years of experience of scholarship. This is years of experience in scholarship that we have before us. These are two ways of looking at this. The other way of looking at this is that you have Iman, you have Islam, you have Ihsan. These are matters of creed. I don't want to say the word belief right now because matters of creed and even matters of intellect, you can see. Matters of action and matters that pertain to the inner life or outward, inward knowledge. Imam Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio, he kind of follows a system like this, right? And he introduced it in the book, Sharani and others as well. They're going with this model, right? They're going with that model. So the idea of how you divide knowledge up is what's going to give you a certain type of understanding. Uh, the way that your framework of how you deal with knowledge, what you importance you give to it, is going to give you a certain type of understanding. Is going to give you a certain type of understanding with regard to with regard to how you understand knowledge, how you work with it. You know, even your philosophy of the world, what you give importance to. So within that framework, wherein you start talking about knowledge of deen and knowledge of dunya, when Imam al-Ghazali was writing, the Muslims were in a different civilizational point. The Muslims were materially advanced. So you had a lot of people becoming doctors. I'm sorry, you had a lot of people, sorry, not becoming doctors, right? At a certain point, they were becoming lawyers, fuqaha. And so he saw that the people, the intention was not right. And the Ummah needed doctors and they needed other areas of knowledge to be occupied. And so he began to delve into the idea or jump into the research of, what is the intention behind these things? Somebody could be studying deen, and in reality, it could be for dunya, where somebody could go study medicine and they're focusing on the human body. They're not focusing on the text of the ayah of the Quran, but they're focusing on the text of the ayah of the creation. And that's important. It has this value. So Imam al-Ghazali, in my reading of it, of his teaching, he started to criticize the fuqaha because he saw that they were in that space. They were becoming scholars because they were pursuing dunya because that's where the wealth and everything, the status was at, which is the opposite in today's time. But the way that Ghazali saw it was that if you can't build the civilization unless you have a diversification of knowledge. Imam Ibn Khaldun doesn't come from that type of tension in the society. Different, and even the personality of Imam Ibn Khaldun is different. Imam al-Ghazali went through a personal life crisis. He went through a crisis in which doubt entered into his thought process. I don't want to say out of adab and respect for Imam Ghazali, I don't want to say into his iman, but into his thinking, because there's no sign that Imam Ghazali doubted Allah wa ta'ala in terms of Allah's presence. It's not like the philosophers. It's not like someone like Descartes, who they say try to imitate El Ghazali later on. Rene Descartes. We use Cartesian coordinates in mathematics. They teach that to kids in the school systems. And the whole modern world is based on uh, that type of thinking that is in Descartes. And Descartes, the idea that he has is he questions whether we can know anything. How do I know that you are not bots? How can I be certain that you guys are not bots? That type of thing. Okay, a robot can imitate your your voice. It can nowadays even your picture. So he reached that level of doubt. He reached that level of doubt where the basics of where we would take something into consideration as being true, we question it. You get what I'm saying? Like just my everyday human interaction, I may have somebody next to me. I start questioning whether that person is real or not. This is stuff that happens when people have bad highs, when they get high and then their high goes bad, and they start having these types of mental journeys where just what's basic for everyone else is no longer basic. And so that's the type of thinking that was introduced in the modern world. And so everything is questioned. Everything is questioned. Whereas for us, you know, th there was a basic, okay, you can question certain things, but there's some basic things that remain as far as human life is concerned. You know, how we know things. It works for science a little bit. For instance, like I may see that for me, looking at the sun's rays, I may look at the sun's rays and I take it for granted. But whereas the scientists will question, well, why is the sun's rays hitting one part of the plant and not hitting the other part of the plant? One part of the plant has light and the other one doesn't have light. You know, the scientists will question that. And then the scientists will go further and like, so but we say that the sun rises and sets, but does it really rise and set? we say that there's up, but is there really up and not down? Or is the world really flat? They start questioning that type of stuff. So that type of thinking, it works to a certain extent, but when you take it too far, it leads to some deep imbalances, right? So Al-Ghazali, rahmatullahi alayhi, he combined these two realities, the reality of the outer and the inner, even though he shows that there's a tension between the two. Uh, and he says if there's going to be a tension between the two, then we pick knowledge of the deen over knowledge of the dunya. But that doesn't help build civilization 100%. In a time period where civilization is in decline, you have to have people that are focusing on uh, the dunya, knowledge of the dunya, but they have to do it to please Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And that is how science was done. So science in the Muslim world, it was done that, okay, the sun is lights, its rays are reflected on the plant. SubhanAllah, how Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala gave the rizq to the plant and how the sun and the plant interact. And when they interact, there's this process of production of oxygen or whatever it may be. So all of that whole dance in nature, whether it be chemicals or atoms or whatever it may be, all of it is looked at in the lens of iman. That's why Islamic science, there is such a thing as Islamic science. Some people say no, but there is such a thing as Islamic science, and that is that nothing that we study, whether it's the cell or whether it's the atom or whether it's the blade of grass or whether it's the chemical compound, all of it is an ayah of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and all of it speaks to the oneness of Allah, right? And that's kind of where, the Kalam scholar could have had a lot of weight, because the Kalam scholar could have gone into that type of thinking and taking us into the meditation, but the Kalam scholars, many of them got stuck on back and forth arguing, right? They got stuck on the original purpose. But the Kalam scholar, and part of that journey was that you rationally reflect on the ayat of creation, because there's two books: the ayat of revelation, which is Quran and Sunnah, and the ayat of creation, which is me, you, the birds, the trees, the atoms, bacteria, everything that's out there that has been created, right? And so the Kalam scholars could have had that other dimension, and it could have been joined to that dimension of, at the end you sit back and you're just like, Alhamdulillah, right? Where the intellect shuts down and says, you know, this can't be created in vain, right? That this is not in vain, it's purposeful, all of the creation. But the arguments, the more that you get stuck in the arguments and the rational thinking, then sometimes you lose that other side, although it's all supposed to be in the defensive tawhid. I mean, we went far from where we're supposed to be, but it's kind of, that's how it is. The knowledge in Al Azhar, in the traditional way, you can't do this in the university so much because the time frame in the university doesn't allow for this. But they try, the scholars, they try to do it in the university setting. But in the masjid, when you sit down, you take a book like this and you're studying all of these sections. So then you pause on this one thing, intention here, and then you expand on it really far out. And sometimes people get lost in, like, what was the class about? But it comes back down to the text is guiding. This text is guiding our reflection. Even if we deviate and we go off into what they call tangents and we come back again, That journey of knowledge, which is circular, is not one, two, three. It's circular. It's showing that everything is connected. That's the idea that knowledge is interconnected. It builds the student up because although we may cover a little bit, then you go into depth on one thing, you come back and then you review again what you studied. That's the traditional way, at least in Al Azhar. That's the traditional way of knowledge to show the interconnectedness. And so the student is not just studying fiqh, the student is studying aqidah, the student is studying language, the student is studying history, the student is studying hadith, is whatever. There could be a hadith here, and we pause and we reflect on the hadith. Last time we were talking about translation. Even this right here, like when it says Allah is the greatest, that shouldn't be there, right? That should be it should be, and I didn't correct it. It should be literally Allahu Akbar, right? It should be Allahu Akbar. Why would we say that it should be Allahu Akbar? Anybody? Instead of instead of it being spelled out. Why? And I mentioned this before. Ismail Faruqi, the late great Dr. Ismail Faruqi, may Allah bless him and have mercy on him and accept him. He died. He was murdered in Philadelphia. He has a book, it's called Toward Islamic English. In the philosophy of translation, he says it's a very short book, but Dr. Taha Jabir, who was one of my teachers, and he worked closely with Dr. Ismail Faruqi. Dr. Taha Jabir, who was, may Allah have mercy on him, except he was one of the top scholars in Usul al-Fiqh. He did a translation, not into English, but from manuscript, an edited version of Al-Mahsul by Imam al-Razi. And Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi was considered to be one of the greatest scholars in Usul al-Fiqh and Tafsir and Kalam and all of that. So he did one of the best editions of his book Mahsul, and he never got a penny for it. He said it was taken, it was printed, sold, copies sold everywhere. He said that Ismail Faruqi's one of the best books that he had was this small book. Is called Toward Islamic English, which is not necessarily the most extensive book. He also has a book called Tawheed and its implications for life and thought, which is in English, is available PDF. But in this book, he talks about translation. He says some words should, if you're gonna pass them from the Arabic into English, some words should remain, like Allahu Akbar, like Alhamdulillah, like Assalam. When you remove, because this is part of the Salah itself, right? In this sense. But his philosophy was that these words have an impact. And if you translate them, you lose the impact because the words that are used in the Quran and the Sunnah are part of a knowledge system. And that knowledge system revolves around those words. And so, in order to really grasp that knowledge system and that knowledge system to have an impact on you, those words have to be in place. They shouldn't be translated, but the meaning should be communicated. Okay? The meaning should be communicated. That's extremely important. So again, Dr. Ismail Faruqi, his concept was that Islam has this vocabulary, and that vocabulary is special because it was designated by Allah wa Ta'ala. Remember that the Arabic language existed before the revelation of the Quran. But the Quran transformed the Arabic language and gave the Arabic language meanings that it did not have. Remember, the Arabs the Arabic speakers, in which they were listening to the Quran, they were masters of the Arabic language. They were poets. So they knew how to play with language. They knew depths of language. They were poets. And so the Arabic language changed in meaning because of the Quran and the Sunnah, but mostly because of the Quran. So the reality of the situation, revelation in other words, Ismail Faruqi says that there's this network of knowledge and is rooted in the words, the key words that are in the Quran especially, and in the Sunnah, and then by default in Islamic uh tradition. So he says that some words should be left the way that they are. Like we said, Allahu Akbar, Alhamdulillah, Salam, Assalamu alaikum. You know what I'm saying? That type of thing. These words remain and we learn the meanings of them versus saying God is greatest, praise be to God, uh, peace be with you. Those words that has an impact, but it's not going to be the same as the idea of Allahu Akbar, Alhamdulillah. And it's not just the issue of learning an Arabic word. No, it's the issue of learning words as part of a system. Words as part of a system. And that system of thinking and a system of meanings, it is impactful upon us and it transforms us, right? It transforms us when we understand it properly. So that was the thinking that Ismail Faruqi had, right? That was the thinking that Ismail Faruqi had. And so, from the angle of what was translated, and it's no criticism of anybody, no criticism of the sheikh who translated this text, may Allah preserve him, but it's just a different philosophy. That's why I went and I redid most of the translation, and edited and so on and so forth to add these other elements to give another dimension. So, even the text itself, so the two things that we learned uh, today, we summarize them among other things, is this system of knowledge that is communicated in this text. So there's a way of organizing the concepts of the Salah that is beneficial as a teacher and as a student, as a teacher, right? When we're able to tell the people the Salah is divided into three categories: words, acts, and that which is neither word or acts, then we're able to pause and we're able to justify the spiritual life, the spiritual dimensions in this area here. We combine the knowledge of the outer and the inner, as is the system of Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi, although Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi didn't write this book, but we keep with that system. And so we come back to this point, and as a part of the uh, concept of translation. So here put in italics, all of the words of the prayer are sunan. All of the actions of the prayer are obligatory, right? And so again, that allows us to be able to already create a frame in our minds so that we can judge the soundness of the salah. We can judge the soundness of the salah, right? So if we leave out some words, but they're none of these three words, then we know that as far as words are concerned, we're in good shape because the words that are obligatory are saying Allahu Akbar, reciting Al Fatiha, and As Salam. Although is a deficiency in the Salah if we miss the dhikr in sujood or if we miss the dhikr in ruku', it's a deficiency, right? But it doesn't invalidate the Salah. And when we talk about all of the actions of the prayer are obligatory, so when it comes to a matter of action, we can look here, we're dealt with words, what has to be said in the Salah. Here we're dealing with what has to be done in the Salah. This makes it easy for the new Muslim as well, or for the young child to learn the Salah, that there's words and there's things, right? So that's uh, something that we have to look at and focus on. how to divide up the salah so we can teach it and so that we can judge its soundness, right? So in judging the soundness, we have to judge on these two planes, words and actions. Now, there's other things like those things that don't pertain to word or action as well. And he mentions them here. Like, for instance, facing the Qibla. And for the strong student of knowledge, let's put this like this for the moment. For the strong student of knowledge,
Start an OnlyFans or something, man.
the question comes
Start
up
on, yo, you should start an OnlyFans, B.
is, do we always have to
I'll
face
leave
the Qibla,
room you all yourself know right.
right? So that comes up. So, for instance, we know one of the distinguishing points between the Fard Salah and the Sunnah Salah is that in the Sunnah Salah is not necessary to face the Qibla, although it's something that's encouraged, right? There's other issues that come up here as well. What about if you don't know the Qibla? In the Maliki fiqh, there's a long discussion on that, as well as in other madhab, about what to do when you can't face the Qibla, right? The other issue that comes up is that how do you determine the Qibla? And we pointed to that before. Do you depend solely on electronic devices? Or do you learn geography? Do you learn how to master the landscape, not only the natural landscape, but also uh, the mapping out of a particular building? Like if you know that there's the northeast quarter, or there's the southern block, or whatever it may be, the east end. These things allow us to be able to have some determination of the qibla, because in this issue, in the facing of the qibla, the the believer, the uh the believer that is engaging the salah in this issue, that person should make what we call ijtihad. When we look at the more advanced books in fiqh, they should make ijtihad. That's one of the things that comes about as far as the discussion on qibla, that the person that's going to pray the salah should make an effort. And that effort is not just a plain effort. That effort should be a real effort to determine their qibla. You can utilize sometimes the compass in your car. Some cars have compasses built into them. You can utilize the compass on your phone. You can utilize the compass that is for camping, or military compass, or whatever. But those are devices. And so you have to know the weakness and strength of that. The other side is you should know the landscape. Now, is there a civilizational point that comes up here? Is there knowledge that has developed from this issue, from the issue of the qibla and from the issue of the salah? I mentioned this before some time back. Can anybody think about how this can advance a civilization?
I'm thinking like the architecture or the engineering, like develop.
Astronomy, astronomy, astronomy got into the whole issue of mapping the stars out, and mapping the stars out, you're able to understand the movement of the heavens and time and direction and so on and so forth. And the Muslims,
Would it be possible to develop a city or a society that was like everything was facing towards the Qibla?
they have
Like,
that they have that set up like that. Most of the masajid are set up like that. Even
oh,
in West Africa, Sheikh Ahmed Baba, he had a landscape that he mapped. Not Ahmed Baba, Ahmed Baba. Ahmed Baba, not Ahmed Baba. Ahmed Baba, they say that he had a land. his geographical zone, he built on that model. But not only him, others as well. Yeah,
Yeah, like
many that concept came up, but the Muslims began to go into mathematics and astronomy, and other sciences developed from this. Like when you start going into inheritance, then that's where you get fractions and all of this type of stuff. One of the best, and maybe we can bring it up at some point in time. One of the best discussions that I've heard on this has been from Sheikh Ali Juma. Although Sheikh Ali Juma, because of his political positions and his serious anti Salafi position that he took later in life, an anti-Islamic movement, some people have disparaged him, or he took some positions, some fatwas that he took were problematic, but that doesn't invalidate his knowledge on the other levels. So he he was one of my teachers for some time. Uh, I didn't study as much with him as others, but I took a lot from him because of his approach towards knowledge. Not necessarily those fatwa and stuff like that, but his methodology of dealing with the tradition. I study his texts, his approach to usul al-fiqh as well. But he brings up these points, uh, that how it is from these issues in Salah, the Muslims began to focus on sciences that had nothing to do with the Salah directly. And that's why we were talking about the categorization of knowledge is important to understand, because the categorization or the classification of knowledge, systematizing knowledge, when you understand it, you see how civilization emerges. So even in when we talk about purity, see what I'm saying? When we talk about purity, the Muslims from an early age had the understanding of bacteria, right? It took Europe outside of Al Andalus a good portion of time to understand the concept of cleanliness, hygiene, and the relationship between hygiene and sickness. Whereas in Timbuktu, these things were already understood. Sheikh Anta Diop, who was, who was part of the Negritude movement. The Negritude is really a French word. It's really basically is the black movement. And Sheikh Anta Diop was one of the main scholars that had impacted a lot of black studies here in the US and outside. But in any event, he has a book which talks a little bit about Timbuktu. It's called Pre-Colonial Black Africa or something like that, to that effect. But he talks about also the inner unity in African civilizations, how Egypt was actually a brainchild of inner Africa, not the opposite. Because people like Hegel and Nietzsche and all of them, but especially Hegel. Hegel was a German Prussian philosopher who preceded the Nazis. And then the Nazis, they drew a lot upon that thinking. But Hegel separated Egypt from Africa. And he said that it was not a production of African genius, that type of thing, Black African genius. And so, in any event, back to the point, Sheikh Anta he makes the claim that Egyptian civilization was nothing but a child of inner African civilizations. And so some of that transmitted itself to places like Timbuktu. So that's why you see in Al Andalus and in Timbuktu, in my theories, uh, you see diversification of knowledge. The Muslims in Al Andalus and the Muslims in Timbuktu, which they're like, you know, two faces of each other. They don't limit themselves to just knowledge of Quran and the Sunnah. So when you look at Qadi ibn Arabi al-Maliki, he says that the child should first study logic and language. Sheikh Uthaymeen had an issue with that. Say, how can you tell the student to first study, logic and this and that and so on and so forth? But the thinking of Qadi ibn Arabi was that if you build the child's cognitive abilities, then the child's thinking would develop so that they can have a good insight into Quran and Sunnah and other knowledge. Now I understand what Sheikh Uthaymeen is saying. Sheikh Uthaymeen is saying, no, we ground the children in Quran and Sunnah, in memorization and a basic familiarity, and then we build the intellects out. That's an approach. That's an approach. But and these are good discussions. The good discussions. But where they were where they were at was not there. And the same thing, Ibn Khaldun has the similar discussion. He says that the Maliki school, one of the deficiencies was these small texts like this. When you have a lot of these texts and they contradict each other, people. This is one of the things that I don't like about the Maliki school is that there's no resolution sometimes on what are the obligations, the number of obligations in Salah. What are the number of things that invalidate the Salah? You'll find that there's big discussions on this, and you'll find one scholar will differ from another scholar. And that resolution is not always clear. So then you have to bypass the little books and you have to go to the bigger books and you have to kind of draw from the bigger books and impose it on the little books. You get what I'm saying? Or that's one way out of the problem. Another way out of the problem is to teach the student early on uh, that the obligations in the prayer um, that you may find in this text is just a stepping stone to learn how to judge the prayer. And then that way you kind of get out of that bind of why does this scholar differ from this scholar? Because there's too much differing among the texts. Whereas in other madhab is not always at that level that we see in the Maliki school. And so that's why it's important. That's why sometimes the popularity of the text is important because the concept of popular text, because it just standardizes it. It standardizes the understanding of the people. Like Imam Abi Zayd al-Qairo, Imam Ibn Ashr's, his text, Murshid al-Mu'ayyin, also with it, it kind of just standardizes what is the position so that the student is not going back and forth, right, in terms of understanding. Why does that come up? Because today we've been talking about educational philosophy. So Ibn Khaldun, he goes down to the level of what is the text that the student should study. Should the student stay stuck on a lot of these primary mukhtasar type text, the mutun at this level? Is it good for the student? He says too many of them, no. And even to some extent, if you look at Sheikh Uthman Danfodi, he doesn't agree with that either. That's why he says, the student shouldn't stay a whole lifetime to become a scholar. Learn what you need to learn and then you move forward. So that's why we emphasize in this text the organizational genius of the text. And then there's some concepts, yes. Now, when it comes to this point here, uh, when it comes to this issue, the ruling of the person who rejects the obligation to pray, I put it that way. I put this in there versus the one who denies any of the obligations of the prayer. I have to build this out more. This, the one who denies any of the obligations of the prayer, like the ruku' should be ruku' or the sujud, is this person is classed as a disbeliever. He's a kafir and a murtad. Not just a disbeliever, but he's murtad on top of that. He renegated or apostated or left the deen. This is like extreme. Why? Because this is a basic text. But from the angle of getting the person to understand we don't play with the salah, it's not extreme. right? That in a Muslim society, the salah is the core of the society. No one comes in and undermines the salah, not the leader, not the follower. Then that makes sense. But if you're bringing this into play, this idea here, leave leave this side, leave this aside for the second. Leave this aside. We're only dealing with this here, this concept, right? We're dealing with what's in green. So how do we make sense of this? Do we impose this on the brothers in the masjid or the brothers on the cell block or the brothers on the journey or in the college campus? No, because remember that our position is the position of da'wah. But do we let them know, like, look, the person who denies the obligation of salah, rejects it completely, is outside of Islam? Yes, but
Mhm.
how do we go about that? Do we sugarcoat it or are we straight up with it? We're straight up with it, but we also have to look at the mental state of people, right? And the
Right.
operations that we have, not necessarily how we may not always say this out loud, but in our operations, we're looking, is there an excuse? One of the problems in the what happened with the movement of Sheikh Abdul Wahab, Muhammad Abdul Wahab, is they were saying that the issue of takfir was coming on a regular basis. This person didn't do this person was considered kafir. So that became a big issue. You see what I'm saying? That became a big issue. So the person, the person who didn't follow certain things immediately, there was what we call yani la udhr bi jahl, that there's no excuse due to ignorance. In other words, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Hey, that's a even in American society. But we can't operate with the people like that because one of the issues that comes up is this issue from the prerequisites of of obligation or that which obligates the salah is to be Muslim. But in the text it says, el Islam. So and that's also one of the conditions of you know of soundness. But he doesn't mention it here. Is that the person is a Muslim? In order for the salah to be sound, he doesn't mention it here because he he brings this up over here. Now remember, in this part in West Africa, they were dealing with people of other religions. So they're taking really hard stances because they don't want people to mix the religions together as well.
Mhm.
See what I'm saying? They don't want people to mix the religions. They want people to know. But when we deal with the people, we have to be careful in dealing with these are two issues. One is rejecting the obligation to pray, and the second issue is rejecting a part of the prayer, right? And one of the things that's important here is that the reason why this is also being mentioned is because these things are clear. These are not matters of my opinion, your opinion, my school, your school. No one differs on this issue as far as the madhab. Not even the Shia and all of them. No one differs as far as a Muslim. That the salah, how it looks like, is that there's ruku and there's sujood, right? But do we, a new Muslim, do we come if the person says, I don't believe in that? Do we automatically throw them outside of the deen? So then the other issue comes up. He uses the same. This is why I highlighted this in yellow at the top. He uses the same process that is used with the person that negates the salah. He uses the same process with the person that denies a portion of the prayer that's an obligation. If he repents, he should be left alone, right? But if if we go with this stuff, that if the person is executed if he doesn't, if we apply that literally, then we're gonna get into a deep dilemma, and it is not an issue of uh being scared to apply the dean and this and that. No, that's the conditions for this are not in place. The conditions for this are not in place. The conditions for implementing something like this are not in place. So we shouldn't take, that's the danger of taking from these texts literally and think that we're just going to apply this. That's just like people reading in the books of fiqh about the murtad, and then they start applying these rulings. This person is a kafir because it is this person, because that's not a good way of fiqh. That's not a good way of fiqh. You know, because these things are written in a certain type of context and being applied to certain realities. That doesn't mean they're applied to every reality. Now, if a person denies an obligation of the prayer, that question now the point of Aqidah is in question. But if the person says, I don't deny Allah, so you work with them on that level. They may not be at the point where they completely agree with the prayer. They may have a different concept of prayer. Right. And that's why, for instance, in the hadith, when Mu'adh being sent to Yemen, is going stage by stage. It doesn't impose upon the person everything at one time with regard to what the deen obligates. That's why Sayyid Qutb was questioned on his positions, because Sayyid Qutb was like, if you deny the deen, pretty much, if you don't rule by the laws of Islam, you're a kafir. There's no gradation. There's no uh system by which you're dealing with the people. And so those were some of the major critiques that were being waged not only at the movement of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab, but also at Sayyid Qutb, also the Sanusiya movement. The Sanusiya movement, Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi criticized them. Sheikh Abdul Hakim Quick brings this up because they were asked the people, "Where is Allah?" And they were not followers of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab, or they were Kalam movement, an Ashari Kalam school. So the takfir issue is a big issue, right? So what we want uh, is we want the people to understand the importance of what are the obligations of the salah. But then the person can understand what the obligations of the salah are, and then struggle at this level. And they know all. They may not say. They may say yes. The ruku' and the sujood. These things are obligations of the prayer. But then when it comes to establishing the salah, they're struggling out of laziness or out of addiction or out of whatever it may be, like straight neglect or whatever it may be. So that's the condition that we're in. So the condition that we're in, it requires, is requiring uh to go back to this and work on the condition of the heart of the people, right? And their thinking about things. Because again, you don't want somebody to look at these things and then automatically they're like, yeah, that's it. 1 minute they're like high ho on the deen, and because they're praying 5 times a day or they're doing this, and then they're imposing this, and then next you find they burn out, and after they were classifying everybody a kafir and this that, and you know they burn out or they go crazy. That's just the reality of the situation. But here in a solid community, uh, the person naturally begins to practice. That's why, even though you may agree with it or may not agree with it, but the educational point is sound. That's why the idea of, for instance, Tablighi Jamaat with the 40 days concept, the 40 days idea, you can debate on it whether it's sound or not sound, but the idea of being in a collective space and practicing together for a certain period of time over and over and over again, that instills on in the Muslim the practice. In that regard, there's no debate among the scholars. Even when that was brought up to some of the Salafi scholars like Sheikh Uthaymeen and others, they didn't see an issue in that. They saw benefit. Some scholars, of course, they were against it because they have issues with the teachings of Tabligh Jamaat and Aqeedah and so on and so forth. But all of that aside, just the idea of training people to implement the Salah, being in that environment, that's where we're at. Because most of us will not pray 5 times a day, right? Most of us will not be praying 5 times a day in these environments that we're living in today's time, together in Jama'ah. But the idea of creating an environment where people are are practicing the salah together, no one differs over that. And like we mentioned, even the Salafi scholars that were critical of Tabligh Jama'ah and these aspects, they they didn't see an issue with it, right? The issue of collective prayer, of gathering the people around collective prayer to instill in them the practice of the salah. And that's what's important, right? That has deep educational value, and that's a tarbiyah process. That's a form of tarbiyah that's very essential. And really, that's really where the scholars of tasawwuf, they were thoughtful. How can we instill in the people the quality of the salah? Well, that's not an issue of bid'ah there. That's not an issue of bid'ah. Calling the people to come together for X amount of time, 3 days, a day, a week, a month, whatever, and consistently pray together with the goal of instilling in the people the quality of salah. That's an educational point, right? Until it becomes part of the character of the person. Just the same thing like going to the masjid, calling the people to go to the masjid with frequency and regularity until that becomes part of them. That's where we think in terms of education, right? So this part we didn't cover much. Realize also that there are four things which suffice for four things, and there are four things which do not suffice for four things. Okay, so if you remember that we said that all of the actions of the prayer are obligatory except for three. So the raising of the hands in the Maliki school is not an obligation upon the takbir, with the takbirat al-ihram. If you should do it, but if you miss it, takbirat al-ihram is suitable. So the opening takbir, you have to say takbir. It suffices for the raising of the hands. Say Allahu Akbar. So if you say Allahu Akbar, it suffices, but there's deficiency, right, in this thinking. The recitation of Al-Fatiha suffices for reciting the surah after Al-Fatiha. So if you restrict yourself to, you say Allahu Akbar, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Because in a Maliki school, the Basmillah, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. The Basmillah is silent. The Basmillah is silent and even debated over, but we don't want to get into all of that. Just keep it at the level of silence. So the Fatiha begins with Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Maliki Yawm Al-Din. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. Ihdina siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladina an'amta alayhim. غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Even the Ameen is silent. But in any event, it's said. So if you don't recite another surah after Al-Fatiha, then the Fatiha that is sufficient from the Quran, right? But you can't leave out Al-Fatiha. Just like you can't leave out the Allahu Akbar. You can leave out the raising of the hands, but the Allahu Akbar, the takbir, the words, you can't leave that out. You you can't leave out the Fatiha. Now, the prostration should be on the forehead and the nose, but minimum, right? If you prostrate here, it suffices for if you miss here. But is deficient here. And there's debates among the ulama, but the minimum is prostration of the head, right? Saying the salam, salamu alaikum. Remember, in the Maliki school, the salam has its unique aspects, and we're not going to go into all of that right now. But one of the things is when we end the salah, salamu alaikum, and then there's assalamu alaikum, right? Turning to the right. So if you say assalamu alaikum and you don't turn to the right, that's sufficient. That's sufficient. That's enough for the salah, right? So these things are kind of giving you what are the bottom lines, right? These points that are being made. What are the bottom lines that if they're accomplished, that everything kind of moves or everything is in order, right? These 4 points. That's what I like about this book. I appreciate that from the book that he's just getting to the core. It's not getting to a lot of details. He's getting to the core, what you need to know, right? Just like, for instance, in Jalsatul Wusta, the middle sitting, for instance, you pray 2 rak'at of dhuhr, and in the second rak'ah, you don't uh you don't sit there. You forget to sit, and you forget to make the tashahhud or send the durood on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in there, your salah is still sound. In the Shafi school, they have a lot of issues with that, right? That's why, because from madhab to madhab, you may have some differences. That's why it's important within the madhab to be clear, on what it is that you're practicing internally in the madhab. You get what I'm saying with that? Because from one school to another school, they differ. So you don't want to be confused also internally in the madhab. And that's the deficiency sometimes of madhab studies, that the student, the student can stay stuck for a long time on what is allowed in the method, what's not allowed in the method. You can go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth on that issue. Are we still here? Is everyone still here? Can you hear me? Hello?
What was that shit?
I was trying to see if you were still with me.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here, shit. I just keep the mic muted because I got a lot going on around. So I want to make sure you're not no distraction.
So let's end there, inshallah. So that was, that's the idea of be clear. And what I had a teacher that stated, sometimes it's better to master one book than to jump from book to book. That has its benefit. We, what we want to do is we want to get this basic framework, and then we want to look at the book where Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi is talking about the evidences. We didn't want to just do that without some sort of framework in place, because that can create confusion. But you have to be aware of that problem that is in the study of Maliki fiqh, where there's discussions and debates about what are the invalidators of the salah, what are uh, the conditions, how many things are obligatory. Uh, I should say not conditions. How many things are obligatory in the salah? They differ. So don't get too caught up in that. If you jump from one book, it says this, another book, it says that. Just know that's a framework. This is a framework. Because outside of the school, you also have other madhab, and the other madhab also have their positions. So you don't want it to be where your mind, you start falling, well, this is all differences of opinion. What's right here? No, there, there are ways to organize our study of the Quran and the Sunnah. And there's reasons sometimes why they differ. don't make a big deal out of it. But it is a little frustrating, and that was brought up by Imam Ibn Khaldun, right? Especially in the study of Maliki fiqh, we mentioned that sometimes that lack of consistency in position, it can create distortion in the student's thinking. But as long as you know that these texts are there to build up our thinking, even if there's differences between them, there's no issue. That's why, and I wanted to close with this. That's why I'm not always opposed to, on a personal level. Just, I mean, not that I'm a person of standing in this regard, but I'm not always opposed to non-madhabi fiqh. Because if you can clarify for the student how to practice at the basic level, whether it's they follow this system or that system, it doesn't matter as long as they organize and they have an ability to know this is sound, this is not sound. Because the study of the madhab requires deep commitment. And so if a student is not really willing to be committed to study at a deep level, you don't want to confuse them with academic points, right? And so that's why some of the scholars they were not opposed, and that's under the principle in fiqh or usul al-fiqh that the madhab of the mustafti, the madhab of the person that asks for fatwa, is the madhab of the mufti. So they can follow whoever they want in knowledge. That's not a Salafi point. It's not a deviant point. That's there in the literature in usul al-fiqh for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They have said that. But what happens is that when it comes to simplification, they just say, "Oh, just follow the madhab." That works in a place where everybody's following the same thing, like Morocco or Punjab or some place like that, where they're just following one thing. But in a place where people are following multiple things, like Cairo or, some places, some cities in the US, there's a lot of confusion. Like in Philadelphia, mostly everybody's following something close to the Salafi, Hanbali, Albani approach. So they're kind of on the same thing. They kind of on the same platform. When you go, for instance, to uh, other places, like you go to places in Chicagoland, in the west suburbs, mostly everybody's on the Hanafi school together over there. So, like I mentioned earlier, if you bring something else, then you kind of deviating. So you find a lot of people there that that's how they practice. That's their knowledge. Not everybody's going to be following that, but that's how it is. You know what I'm saying? So you from an educational side, you let them flow with that. You build on that. You don't do like one brother. He left following the Salafi da'wah and he became Maliki. So he took his whole library and he's throwing it out like it was kufr. It's like, bro, it's like, you were majority was the Hanbali school. Sometimes Sheikh Al-Albani's positions come in and others, like maybe like Sheikh Mukbil. That was a school of thought. Let it be. Okay, fine. You became a student of the Maliki school. It doesn't mean you change religions. It doesn't mean you change religion. So a good teacher will build on that. A good teacher will build on that, right? And so then you have some people, like for instance, you see that in Morocco, they combine, uh, the Hanbali school and the Maliki school. Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi combined the Qadri Tariqa and the Maliki school along with other schools. So sometimes you find that flavor because Sheikh Abdul Qadir al Jalani was Hanbali. On some things, you find that it overflows. That's not an issue. The schools are not different religions. They're methodological approaches to studying the Dalil. And
Yeah.
and until people realize that, we will remain in confusion. But also, like we said, we can simplify it for the average person. Like one of them is Sheikh Al Azhar. He said, minimum learn fiqh sunnah. Even though fiqh sunnah is criticized by some people, it's a well-known book. It simplifies for people how to practice. Minhaj al-Muslim, you know what I'm saying, by Sheikh Abu Bakr al-Jazairi. Actually is a well-structured written book. And sometimes it will give you insights that even studying basic madhabi fiqh or not on some things. So those are educational approaches. We shouldn't get caught up into that. This is better than this and that. No, this has this flavor, that has this goal, this has this approach. That's how the knowledge is. And when you go and you study, for instance, in the Sharia at the university level, in the university system, they're going to look at all of that. And that's the benefit of the university studies. The university is going to look at fiqh as one big umbrella. So you have fiqh as is presented in tafsir, fiqh as is presented in hadith commentary, fiqh as is presented in uh, the whole issue of comparative between the different schools of thought, different schools of fiqh. Fiqh as is fiqh in the legal systems. So they're going to study fiqh as in the madhab at the lower levels without evidences, fiqh at the higher level or the mid level with evidences. So they study fiqh from every angle, fiqh and contemporary issues. Fiqh as a methodology. They study fiqh. They look at fiqh as a whole, as just one big body of knowledge. The same thing with aqidah studies. They may have an orientation, you know, but a good aqidah program is going to study the Aqidah overall, historically, the development of the schools, the methodology of the schools. As a matter of fact, right now, one of the biggest issues which the Salafi Dawah helped create was for the Kalam scholars to rethink, are we clear on what the methodology of Kalam is? And so they've been working on that, even though they don't like to say it. You know what I'm saying? Because they're not clear. One of my teachers wrote a book, it's called Ana Ashari. And he did that in imitation of the Salafis in Iskandariya, Alexandria, Egypt, who they had a website called Ana Ashari. I mean Ana Salafi, that I'm Salafi. So he wrote a book, it's called Ashari. And part of that was to clarify methodologically. You know what I'm saying? It has been discussed by honest scholars. It has been discussed that the methodology of Kalam in terms of its principles and it has not been totally clarified. Even the Ashari school itself. And I mentioned this before. Hassan al-Shafi'i, he mentioned that there's been a lot of disservice to Imam Abu Hassan's works. There's been a lot of service in other later day books, but Imam Abu Hassan al-Ashari himself, a lot of his books we don't have. But in the university system, it gives you that breathing room. It gives you that breathing room. But in the halaqah, sometimes because the teacher is trying to not only teach the nazar, the teacher is trying to teach his conviction to the student. That's not always a good approach. You have to give the student some room to make a decision on evidence, right? Not just to make taqleed of you, although that's fine to a certain level. And then the student has to grow after that. And the same thing with hadith. When it comes to hadith studies, it's not just, okay, we're just going to study Bukhari and Muslim and that's it. And we're not going to study anything else because those hadith are weak. That's not how that works. So they study hadith in different areas. And even if it's a good program, because hadith, we know that the scholars of fiqh, some of them are weak in hadith. That's true. That's not it. But not all of them are weak in hadith. But why is it that one scholar, or why is it that in fiqh you may use weak hadith, and then in hadith studies itself, they may reject the hadith? Well, the scholars of fiqh and even the scholars of tafsir, sometimes they'll use the weak hadith because there's nothing else in that. If they don't use that weak hadith may talk about something, a topic that if you remove it, the topic is removed. So it may be, for instance, it may talk about, you know, the prophet. I'm inventing something. The prophet taking a rest on the way to the battle, right? And so they may bring it up in fiqh, in the section of fiqh in the book of Muslim defense or whatever you want to call it. The prophet took a rest on the way to the battle. So then they'll extract from the hadith a whole bunch of rulings. What is the position of the Muslim in this regard and so on. Or for instance, you know, that there may be something said in Asbab al-Nuzul. They may leave a weak hadith. Asbab al-Nuzul means in literally speaking, when the ayat was revealed. Is there a hadith that talks to us about when and why the ayat was revealed? Well, there may be some story that's there about two people started fighting on a particular issue, arguing back and forth with each other. And then the
You
Prophet
share.
intervened. This is an example, I'm making it up. The Prophet intervened, and then the Prophet told them, if the Muslims continue to fight, then they lose their understanding. That's similar to the story of Laylatul Qadr, that we lost the meaning of Laylatul Qadr because the Muslims were arguing back and forth with each other. So, I mean, we lost the day. Sorry, we lost the day which Laylatul Qadr is. We don't know exactly when Laylatul Qadr is because the Muslims were disputing. So, the scholars of Tafsir, they may use these weak hadith, and the scholars of fiqh, it's not always because they are weak in hadith. It's sometimes it may be because they use the hadith for knowledge. The same thing with the scholars of tasawwuf. Scholars of tasawwuf may find in a particular weak hadith um, a teaching, a teaching on on purification of the self. So they use that weak hadith. They use, or they may find in that weak hadith an encouragement towards iman, and the language is really strong and good, and it doesn't go against the rest of the Quran and the Sunnah. So when you study hadith, learning why it is that people use weak hadith is different than saying, okay, we're not going to use any weak hadith at all. That's fine if you don't want to use any weak hadith. There's nothing wrong with that. You know what I'm saying? But trying to reject the weak hadith like it's a fabricated hadith, that's a problem. And that has come up in some of the understanding of some people. Or they reject a book like Ihya Ulumuddin or Fada'il A'mal because it uses weak hadith only, or instead of you criticize the book in a nice way, in a scholarly way, whatever's beneficial is beneficial, whatever's harmful is harmful, whatever is neutral, whatever is questionable is questionable. That's the approach of knowledge, not just like you're either in, or you're out, that type of thing. That's not how knowledge works because human knowledge is always subject to error. But when it comes to revelation, that's a different ballgame. That's why Imam Malik, and we'll end with this, is attributed to him that we take from everyone and we reject from everyone except the occupant of this grave. Infallibility is only with the Anbiya, or protection from error. Infallibility is not always a good translation, right? Impeccability, protection from that type of sin and deficiency which will destroy the message, is only that type of protection is only with the Anbiya, and also guiding them from falsehood and so on and so forth. That everyone else, all of us, are subject to error. There's many times I say something and it's not what I'm thinking. You know what I'm saying? I'm saying the opposite of what I'm thinking, right? Due to a number of different reasons. And so I can be subject to error. I've sat in classes with major teachers, major scholars in Islam, and they make mistakes. They make mistakes, and when they talk, the, how we deal with that, it shows our character. It shows our character how we deal with that. You can easily say, "Oh, you're supposed to be a scholar. You made a mistake," or you can give the person the benefit of the doubt, and you can, correct it in your own mind. That's why knowledge is a process. Knowledge is a process. Well, we end
Yeah.
with that, inshallah. We'll get back to the actual text next week. We're going to be going into the obligations of Salah, which are 15 in this book of the Sulam. And We're going to work with that a little bit. I'm going to try to work on the translation as well, so that by the time we finish this, the translation will be edited and more workable, more workable than what it is. That's the whole goal or aim, inshallah, if Allah allows. Then, we keep reading, the Sheikh Uthman then Fodi's book as well, uh, because it has the evidences. It has the evidences. So we end with that. We ask Allah to accept from us and to forgive us for our deficiencies, inshallah. And until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Fi amanillah.